The gavel froze midair above Judge Patterson's bench, his weathered hand trembling as every eye in the packed Socorro courthouse turned toward the creaking double doors. Esperanza Delacroix stood alone at the defendant's table, iron shackles catching the harsh September sunlight, her dark hair framing a face that had accepted death with the quiet dignity of her Cherokee ancestors. The marriage certificate wasn't just paper. It was salvation wrapped in buffalo hide and sealed with territorial law. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wildfire as the stranger's spurs clinked against worn wooden floors, each step echoing louder than thunder in the sudden silence. Old Mary Whitehorse dropped her rosary, the beads scattering like teardrops across pine planks that had witnessed too many injustices. The same green eyes that had watched her mother die in these very streets now held something they'd never possessed before. Hope flickering against 21 years of abandonment. "Order in this court!" Patterson's voice cracked like a whip, but his authority had already begun to crumble. Who was this man, and how could 3 words, "She's my wife," shatter a verdict that had seemed carved in stone? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, Socorro had been a different kind of dying. The silver veins that snaked through the Magdalena Mountains were playing out like a dying man's last breaths, each extraction weaker than the last. But it was the kind of slow death that still allowed hope. Hope that one more shaft might strike the mother lode. Hope that the railroad rumors might prove true. Hope that tomorrow might not require packing everything into a wagon and rolling toward another frontier dream. Esperanza Delacroix had arrived in that autumn of fading promises, stepping off the supply wagon with nothing but a canvas bag and a letter of introduction written in Father Miguel's careful script. She was 18 then, with the kind of quiet beauty that made men look twice and women whisper behind their hands. Her Cherokee mother's cheekbones caught the light like carved stone, while her father's French blood showed in the way she held her spine straight as a rifle barrel, even when the world tried to bend her. Judge Cornelius Mortimer had been waiting on his ranch house porch that October morning, a man of 55 years, who wore his wealth like armor and his authority like a loaded gun. The Mortimer spread stretched across 15,000 acres of the best grazing land in Socorro County, an empire built on cattle, silver claims, and what folks politely called territorial politics. What they didn't say aloud was that Judge Mortimer's fortune had grown considerably each time the Apache troubles flared up, and Cherokee families found their land claims mysteriously voided by court order. "Girl's got good breeding," he'd told his foreman, watching Esperanza climb the porch steps with her shoulders squared and her green eyes meeting his gaze without flinching. "French blood keeps them pretty. Cherokee blood keeps them useful. Perfect combination for what I need." What Mortimer needed, he'd explained in his study that first evening while she stood beside his desk like a soldier awaiting orders, was someone who could read and write, someone who could speak Spanish to the ranch hands and Cherokee to the reservation traders, someone young enough to learn his ways and smart enough not to ask too many questions about the locked filing cabinets or the midnight visitors who came calling when the moon was dark. The judge had lost his only legitimate son 5 years earlier during what the territorial newspapers called Indian troubles. But what everyone in Socorro County knew had been an ambush that went wrong. Young Timothy Mortimer had been riding with a surveying party, marking boundaries for a railroad spur that would connect the silver mines to the main line. The Cherokee Tribal Council had sent warnings that the proposed route ran straight through their sacred burial grounds, but Timothy had pressed forward anyway, convinced that his father's influence would smooth over any legal complications. They'd found his body at dawn, scalped and stripped, along with two surveyors and their Cherokee guide, a young woman named Little Dove who'd been trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Judge Mortimer had buried his son with full military honors and spent the next 5 years methodically destroying every Cherokee family within 100 miles, using his judicial authority to declare their land claims invalid, their marriages illegal, and their children available for educational adoption by suitable white families. Now, as Esperanza stood in shackles before the same man who'd welcomed her into his home with promises of steady work and honest wages, the irony cut deeper than the iron around her wrists. She'd served him breakfast every morning for 3 years, pressed his judicial robes, and organized the legal documents that had dispossessed dozens of families. She'd witnessed the night meetings where railroad money changed hands, heard the whispered plans to relocate the remaining Cherokee to reservation lands too poor for cattle grazing, and she'd kept her silence because survival had taught her that Cherokee girls who asked inconvenient questions had a tendency to disappear. The morning of September 12, 1884, dawned with a kind of crystalline clarity that made the desert air shimmer like glass, each breath sharp enough to cut through the comfortable lies Socorro County had been telling itself for years. Judge Cornelius Mortimer was found dead in his study at precisely 6:47 a.m., slumped over the mahogany desk that had witnessed the signing of countless fraudulent land transfers and illegal adoption papers. The small brown bottle of belladonna extract sat beside his cold hand like an accusation made of glass and cork. Esperanza had been in the kitchen preparing his morning coffee when Maria Santos discovered the body, her scream piercing the desert silence with such raw terror that even the ranch hands working the distant corral stopped their morning chores and turned toward the main house. By the time Esperanza reached the study, trailing coffee grounds in confusion, Deputy Marshal Carson was already examining the scene with the methodical attention of a man who understood that every detail would be dissected by lawyers and gossips alike. The deputy's sharp gray eyes catalogued everything with professional detachment. The overturned inkwell, the scattered papers bearing the territorial seal, the way Judge Mortimer's fingers were stained with the same purple residue that marked the rim of his evening whiskey glass. But it was the bottle of belladonna that commanded attention, its presence on the desk as deliberate and damning as a signed confession. "Deadly nightshade," Deputy Carson announced to the growing crowd of ranch hands and household staff who'd gathered in the doorway like mourners at a funeral they'd been expecting for years. "Cherokee medicine kills a man slow or fast, depending on how much mercy the poisoner's got in her heart." The accusation hung in the morning air like gunsmoke, and every eye in that crowded doorway turned to study Esperanza's face for signs of guilt or satisfaction. They found neither. Her blue eyes held the same quiet resignation they'd carried for 3 years, the same careful blankness that had protected her through countless nights of Judge Mortimer's discipline and instruction in what he called proper Christian behavior. Within an hour, the ranch house had filled with Socorro's most prominent citizens. Drawn by the scent of scandal and the promise of witnessing justice served to someone they'd always suspected of harboring dangerous thoughts. Banker Morrison arrived with his ledger books, ostensibly to secure Judge Mortimer's financial papers, but actually to ensure that certain transactions remained buried in the mathematical complexity of compound interest and territorial development loans. Dr. Stevens came with his medical bag and his nervous habit of avoiding eye contact with anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about death certificates he'd signed or examinations he'd declined to perform. His preliminary examination of the body was cursory at best. A man Judge Mortimer's age, with his history of heart trouble and tendency toward excessive drinking, could die from any number of natural causes. But the belladonna bottle made natural causes inconvenient for everyone involved. Sheriff Williams arrived last, his badge heavy on his chest and his conscience heavier still. He'd been dreading this moment for 3 years, ever since the night he'd watched little Dove die in Socorro's main street, while he counted the reasons why intervening would cost him more than he was willing to pay. Now her adopted daughter stood accused of the very crime he'd enabled through his silence. The evidence against Esperanza was overwhelming in its simplicity. She was the only person in the house when Judge Mortimer died, the only one with access to his private study, the only one who knew his evening routine well enough to poison his whiskey without detection. More damning still was her complete lack of emotion at his death. No tears, no protests of innocence, no feminine hysteria that might have earned her sympathy from the men who would judge her fate. What the investigators didn't ask was why a servant girl who earned $2 a week would risk hanging for the satisfaction of killing a man who'd never shown her anything but cruelty. They didn't wonder why the belladonna bottle was found so conveniently on his desk rather than hidden or destroyed. They didn't question why Judge Mortimer had been rewriting his will in the weeks before his death, or why he'd been meeting with federal investigators who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about Cherokee land claims and missing families. By afternoon, Esperanza sat in Socorro's single jail cell, a narrow space behind the sheriff's office that smelled of mildew and decades of desperate prayers. The iron cot was covered with a thin blanket that had seen too many prisoners and not enough washing, but she sat upright with her back straight and her hands folded, maintaining the dignity that 3 years of systematic abuse had never quite managed to break. Outside her cell, the conversations continued without her participation. At the saloon, men who'd never spoken to her directly debated the exact nature of her guilt. At the church, women who'd crossed the street to avoid her path prayed for justice while carefully avoiding any definition of what justice might actually mean. And at the Mortimer Ranch, the judge's distant relatives gathered to discuss an inheritance that had suddenly become both more valuable and more complicated than anyone had anticipated. No one visited Esperanza that first night. No one brought her food or offered comfort or asked if she needed anything beyond the basic necessities required by territorial law. She sat in that cold cell like a woman who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life, waiting for a trial that everyone knew would be brief, decisive, and satisfying to a community that had finally found someone to blame for all the guilt they'd been carrying in silence. The courthouse bell had struck 9 when Prosecutor William Hayes rose from behind his polished oak table, his black suit pressed to perfection, and his silver pocket watch gleaming in the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Hayes was a man who understood that justice in Socorro County flowed like water, always finding the path of least resistance, always serving those who could afford to dig the deepest channels. "Gentlemen of the jury," Hayes began, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a traveling preacher, "we gather today not merely to determine guilt or innocence, but to decide what kind of community we wish to be. Do we stand with law and order, with the sanctity of property and the protection of our most respected citizens? Or do we allow savage blood to poison our wells of justice?" The 12 men in the jury box, ranchers, shopkeepers, and mining foremen, shifted uncomfortably in their wooden chairs. Not one Cherokee face among them, not one man who might have known Esperanza's mother, or understood the web of lies that had brought them all to this moment. Judge Patterson had made sure of that during jury selection, dismissing potential jurors with questions that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with maintaining the established order. Hayes paced before the jury box like a caged wolf, his polished boots clicking against the pine floors that had been scrubbed clean but still held the stains of too many years of territorial justice. "The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming," he continued, gesturing toward the evidence table where a small brown bottle caught the light like a venomous snake coiled in glass. "Belladonna, deadly nightshade, found in Judge Mortimer's evening whiskey. a poison known to every Cherokee medicine woman, passed down through generations of primitive knowledge that has no place in our civilized society. Esperanza sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, her shackled hands folded in her lap and her green eyes fixed on some point beyond the courtroom walls. She'd learned long ago that showing emotion in the presence of powerful white men was like bleeding in front of sharks. It only made them circle closer, their hunger growing sharper with each sign of vulnerability. The defendant had motive, Hayes declared, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. For 3 years, she lived under Judge Mortimer's roof, subject to his authority and discipline. Witnesses will testify that she harbored deep resentment against her employer, that she was seen arguing with him on multiple occasions, that she displayed the kind of insolent behavior we might expect from one whose savage nature had never been properly civilized. From the gallery came murmurs of agreement, mixed with uncomfortable shuffling from those who remembered seeing bruises on Esperanza's arms, who'd noticed how she flinched when men raised their voices, who'd wondered why such a bright young woman never smiled anymore. But comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford, not when questioning Judge Mortimer's methods might lead to questions about their own complicity in the systematic destruction of the Cherokee families who'd once called this valley home. Hayes lifted the bottle of belladonna, turning it slowly so the contents caught the light. This poison was found in the defendant's quarters, hidden beneath her mattress like the guilty secret it was. Judge Mortimer's own doctor will testify that the symptoms, the convulsions, the dilated pupils, the final moments of agony, are consistent with nightshade poisoning. The defendant had opportunity, means, and motive. What more evidence could a reasonable man require? The court-appointed defense attorney, a nervous young man named Thomas Whitfield, who'd arrived from Santa Fe just 2 days earlier, rose shakily to his feet. Whitfield had taken one look at the case files, seen the name Mortimer, and understood that his legal career in the territory would be measured in days rather than years if he fought too hard for his client's life. "Your Honor," Whitfield began, his voice barely audible above the whispers from the gallery. "While the prosecution has presented circumstantial evidence, I would argue that—" "Speak up, counselor," Judge Patterson interrupted, his weathered face showing no sympathy for the young lawyer's obvious terror. "The jury can't hear your mumbling." Whitfield cleared his throat and tried again, but his voice cracked like an adolescent boy's. "The prosecution's case relies heavily on speculation and prejudice rather than concrete proof. My client has maintained her innocence throughout these proceedings, and I believe—" "What you believe," Hayes interjected, rising from his chair with predatory grace, "is irrelevant in the face of overwhelming evidence. The defendant's own behavior condemns her. She shows no remorse, no grief for her employer's death, no human emotion at all. What kind of person remains so cold in the face of such accusations unless guilt has frozen their very soul?" The gallery erupted in whispers, and several jurors nodded their agreement. In their world, a proper woman would weep and plead and throw herself on the mercy of the court. Esperanza's quiet dignity, her refusal to perform the theater of feminine helplessness they expected, became evidence of her guilt in their eyes. Old Mary Whitehorse, sitting in the back row with her arthritis-gnarled hands clutching a worn Bible, felt tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She remembered Esperanza's mother, Little Dove, who'd delivered 3 of Mary's grandchildren and never asked for more payment than a meal and a warm place to sleep. She remembered how Little Dove had died in the street outside the general store, beaten to death by 3 drunk cowboys, while the whole town watched from behind closed shutters, too afraid to intervene, too ashamed to look away. Sheriff Tom Williams stood at the back of the courtroom, his badge heavy on his chest and his conscience heavier still. He'd been the one to arrest Esperanza, had looked into those green eyes that reminded him so painfully of his own daughter, lost to scarlet fever 5 years ago, and felt something crack inside his chest. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but in a territory where Cherokee blood was considered guilty until proven innocent, circumstantial was more than enough. The prosecution rested its case as the courthouse clock struck noon and Judge Patterson called for a brief recess. But even as the crowd filed out for lunch and gossip, everyone knew the verdict was already written in the dust and blood of Socorro's violent history. Justice, in this corner of the New Mexico territory, had always been a luxury reserved for those with the right skin color and the proper connections. Esperanza remained in her chair, alone except for the deputy who watched her with suspicious eyes, and for the first time in 3 years she allowed herself to remember her mother's voice singing Cherokee lullabies under the star-drunk desert sky. The afternoon sun had shifted westward, casting longer shadows across the courthouse floor, when the heavy oak doors swung open with a force that made every person in the packed gallery turn their heads. The hinges groaned like wounded animals, and the sudden gust of desert wind that followed carried the scent of sage and something else, something wild and untamed that didn't belong in this temple of territorial justice. Nathaniel Crow. Feather stood framed in the doorway like an apparition conjured from the collective guilt of Socorro County. He was tall and lean, his weathered face bearing the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises and saying goodbye to too many friends. His dark hair hung loose around his shoulders, and the turquoise ring on his right hand caught the light as he removed his wide-brimmed hat. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark as storm clouds and holding secrets that could shatter the careful lies this community had built around itself. "Your Honor," Nate said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent years tracking dangerous men through hostile territory, "I believe you're about to make a grave mistake." Judge Patterson's gavel froze halfway to the bench, his knuckles white around the polished wood handle. The old judge had presided over hundreds of cases during his 20-year tenure, had sentenced men to hang and women to exile, but something in the stranger's voice made his throat constrict with unexpected fear. "This is a court of law, sir, not a saloon for dramatic entrances. State your business or remove yourself from these proceedings." Nate walked down the center aisle with deliberate steps, his spurs creating a rhythm that seemed to match the courthouse clock's steady tick. Every eye followed his progress, some curious, some hostile, others filled with a recognition they couldn't quite place. Old Mary Whitehorse gasped and clutched her Bible tighter, remembering stories her grandmother had told about Cherokee warriors who could appear and disappear like morning mist. "My business," Nate said, stopping just behind the defendant's table where Esperanza sat frozen in her chair, "is with my wife." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Prosecutor Hayes lurched to his feet, his polished confidence cracking like thin ice. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant has no husband. Our investigation was thorough." "Your investigation," Nate interrupted, reaching inside his leather coat with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed, "missed quite a bit." He withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age but bearing the unmistakable seal of the Territorial Registry. "Marriage certificate filed in Santa Fe 2 years ago." Esperanza Delacroix became Mrs. Nathaniel Crow Feather on October 15, 1882. Judge Patterson's face had gone pale as winter bone. He gestured impatiently for the bailiff to retrieve the document, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the certificate and examined the official seal. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for him to declare it a forgery, to restore the comfortable order they'd known just moments before. Instead, Patterson's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his judicial robes had suddenly doubled. "The certificate appears authentic," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. However, this marriage, even if valid, does not absolve the defendant of murder charges. Esperanza turned in her chair for the first time since the trial began, her green eyes meeting Nate's with an expression of profound confusion. She'd never seen this man before in her life, yet something in his face, the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, stirred memories she couldn't quite grasp. There was familiarity there, like a half-remembered dream or a song heard in childhood. "Your Honor," Nate continued, his voice gaining strength, "under territorial law, a married woman cannot be tried for a capital crime without her husband present to provide counsel and testimony. This entire proceeding is invalid." The gallery erupted in angry shouts and confused whispers. Several men rose from their seats, their faces red with indignation. They'd come expecting to witness the final act of justice, the satisfying conclusion to a story that confirmed their beliefs about the inherent danger of Cherokee blood. Now, this stranger was threatening to unravel everything with legal technicalities and documents they'd never heard of. Sheriff Williams stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Mister, I don't know what game you're playing, but this woman has been in custody for 3 days. If she had a husband, where were you when she needed you?" Nate's eyes never left Esperanza's face as he answered, "I've been tracking the men who've been systematically destroying Cherokee families throughout this territory, following a trail of forged documents, illegal land seizures, and murdered witnesses. The trail led me here to this courtroom just in time to prevent another injustice." From his coat he produced another document, this one newer, bearing multiple official seals. "Federal investigation warrant, signed by Territorial Governor Wallace himself. Judge Mortimer was under investigation for corruption, land fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. His death wasn't the act of a vengeful servant, it was the desperate move of a guilty man who knew his crimes were about to be exposed." The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Banker Morrison, who'd been sitting smugly in the front row anticipating the railroad contracts that would come with Esperanza's conviction, felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. The federal government's involvement changed everything. Money that had been safely hidden in local accounts would now be scrutinized by territorial auditors. Relationships that had been mutually profitable would become liabilities. Hayes rallied quickly, his prosecutorial instincts overriding his shock. "Your Honor, these documents prove nothing about the defendant's innocence. Whether or not Judge Mortimer was under investigation has no bearing on the evidence of poisoning. The belladonna bottle was found in her possession. The motive remains clear." "The belladonna wasn't poison," Nate said quietly, his words cutting through Hayes's bluster like a blade through silk. "It was medicine." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting in multiple languages. Judge Mortimer's private medical diary, found hidden in his study after the federal investigation began. He'd been treating himself for heart palpitations with controlled doses of belladonna extract, a common remedy among Cherokee healers but dangerous for anyone without proper knowledge of the dosage. Esperanza's breath caught in her throat. She remembered now, the nights when the judge would call her to his study, not for the usual cruelties but to ask quiet questions about her mother's healing methods. He'd been sick, she realized, his heart failing slowly while his conscience ate away at what remained of his soul. "The morning of his death," Nate continued, opening the journal to a page marked with a strip of leather, Judge Mortimer wrote his final entry. He'd learned that the federal investigation had uncovered evidence of his son's real death, not killed by Cherokee warriors defending their sacred ground, but shot by his own surveying party when he tried to prevent them from desecrating a burial site. Young Timothy Mortimer died trying to do the right thing, and his father spent 5 years destroying innocent families to cover up his own shame. The courtroom had gone completely silent, except for the sound of old Mary Whitehorse weeping into her handkerchief. She remembered Timothy Mortimer as a boy, remembered how he'd been kind to Cherokee children when no one was watching, how he'd argued with his father about the treatment of the reservation families. Judge Patterson's voice cracked as he asked, "What are you saying, Mr. Crowfeather?" "I'm saying Judge Mortimer took his own life with an overdose of belladonna, overcome by guilt and facing the exposure of his crimes. He planted the bottle in Esperanza's room because he knew that even in death his prejudice would be believed over her innocence. One final act of cruelty against the Cherokee people who'd suffered so much because of his lies." Nate turned to face the jury, his dark eyes holding each man's gaze until they looked away in shame. "But this isn't really about how Cornelius Mortimer died. This is about how Little Dove died, beaten to death in your main street while this entire community watched and did nothing. This is about dozens of Cherokee families driven from their ancestral lands by forged court orders and fabricated evidence. This is about children stolen from their parents and given to white families to civilize. This is about a system of justice that protects predators and punishes their victims." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, impossible to ignore or dispel. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, remembering their own participation in land seizures, their own silence when Cherokee families disappeared overnight, their own willingness to benefit from crimes they'd pretended not to see. Sheriff Williams felt the weight of his badge like a stone around his neck. He'd been there the night Little Dove died, had stood in the shadows while 3 drunk cowboys beat her to death for refusing their advances. He'd told himself there was nothing he could do against 3 armed men, but the truth was simpler and more damning. He hadn't tried because saving a Cherokee woman would have cost him his job and his standing in the community. Esperanza rose slowly from her chair, the shackles around her wrists clanking softly in the sudden silence. For 3 years, she'd lived with the knowledge that her mother's death had been witnessed by dozens of people who chose to look away. She'd served breakfast to men who'd cheered while Little Dove breathed her last, had cleaned the clothes of women who'd pulled their children inside and locked their doors rather than bear witness to murder. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks, "I didn't kill Judge Mortimer. But I understand why this community needs to believe I did. It's easier to hang one Cherokee woman than to acknowledge that you're all complicit in the deaths of dozens of innocent people." The truth of her words hit the courtroom like a physical blow, and for the first time since the trial began, the gallery fell completely silent. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of approaching rain. The kind of storm that would wash the dust from the streets, but leave the stains on their souls untouched. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke as Nate's words settled into the stunned silence of the courtroom. Thunder rolled across the desert sky like the drums of ancient warriors, and the first fat raindrops struck the tall windows with sounds like tears against glass. The timing seemed orchestrated by forces beyond human control, as if the very heavens were weeping for the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Judge Patterson sat frozen behind his bench, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the polished wood as if it were the only thing anchoring him to a world that had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. For 20 years, he'd presided over this court with the comfortable certainty that justice was whatever served the interests of Socorro's most prominent citizens. He'd signed the orders that transferred Cherokee land to white ranchers, had dismissed cases of violence against Native families with legal technicalities that protected the guilty and condemned the innocent. Now, facing the wreckage of his complicity, he felt every one of his 68 years weighing on his shoulders like chains. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Crowfeather," Patterson said finally, his voice hoarse with the effort of maintaining judicial authority while his moral foundation crumbled beneath him. "If what you claim is true, this court has been This entire proceeding has been based on false premises. Nate stepped closer to the bench, his dark eyes never wavering from the judge's pale face. Your Honor, with respect, this court has been corrupt long before today. The false premises didn't begin with Esperanza's arrest. They began the day you signed the first fraudulent land transfer, the day you dismissed the first case of violence against a Cherokee family, the day you decided that justice was a commodity to be bought and sold by the highest bidder. The gallery erupted in angry shouts and defensive protests. Banker Morrison leaped to his feet, his face flushed with indignation and fear. "This is outrageous! You can't allow this savage to insult the integrity of our legal system. Judge Patterson has served this community with distinction for 2 decades." "Distinction?" Nate's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Is that what you call it when children disappear from their families and are sold to white households like livestock? When Cherokee women are murdered in broad daylight while your distinguished sheriff stands by and watches? When sacred burial grounds are desecrated for railroad profits?" Sheriff Williams felt the accusation hit him like a physical blow. His hand moved instinctively to his badge, that symbol of authority he'd worn with such pride for 15 years. But now it felt like a mark of shame. A testament to every time he'd chosen comfort over courage, order over justice. He remembered the night Little Dove died, remembered how her screams had echoed through the desert air while he counted the reasons why intervening would cost him more than he was willing to pay. "I was outnumbered," William said quietly, his voice barely audible above the rumble of thunder. 3 armed men against 1. There was nothing I could have done." "Nothing?" Esperanza's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. She rose from her chair despite the shackles, her green eyes blazing with years of suppressed fury. "My mother was calling your name, Sheriff Williams. She was begging you to help her. And you stood in that alley and watched them beat her to death because helping her would have been inconvenient for your career." The raw pain in her words silenced even the most vocal protesters in the gallery. Old Mary Whitehorse was openly weeping now, her arthritic hands shaking as she clutched her Bible. She remembered that night too, remembered watching from her kitchen window as Little Dove fought for her life in the dusty street. She'd been too frightened to intervene, too worried about her own safety to risk helping a Cherokee woman she barely knew. The guilt had eaten at her for 3 years, a cancer of conscience that no amount of prayer seemed to heal. Prosecutor Hayes, sensing his carefully constructed case collapsing around him, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the proceedings. "Your Honor, even if we accept these wild accusations about Judge Mortimer's alleged suicide and corruption, the fact remains that the defendant was found with poison in her possession. The evidence of her guilt is overwhelming, regardless of any supposed federal investigation or convenient marriage certificates." Nate reached into his saddlebag and withdrew another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Territorial Medical Examiner. Dr. Samuel Morrison's preliminary autopsy report, completed yesterday but suppressed by certain interested parties. Judge Mortimer died of heart failure brought on by an overdose of belladonna, but the concentration in his system was far higher than what could be administered through contaminated whiskey. He ingested the poison directly in quantities that could only have been intentional. He handed the report to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Patterson with trembling hands. The courtroom waited in tense silence as Patterson read the medical findings, his face growing paler with each line. The thunder outside seemed to be growing louder, or perhaps it was the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears as the full scope of the injustice he'd been about to commit became clear. "Furthermore," Nate continued, his voice gaining strength as he presented each piece of evidence, "the belladonna found in Esperanza's room was planted there the morning after Judge Mortimer's death. The bottle contains residue of a different batch than what killed the judge, a batch that was confiscated from a Cherokee medicine woman 3 months ago and stored in the evidence locker at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Williams felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Nate's words sank in. Someone with access to the evidence locker had planted the poison bottle to frame Esperanza. Someone who knew that the sight of Cherokee medicine in her possession would be enough to convince any jury of her guilt. The list of people with such access was short, and every name on it represented a pillar of Socorro's respectable society. "The real question," Nate said, turning to face the gallery where the town's most prominent citizens sat in uncomfortable silence, "is not who killed Judge Mortimer. He killed himself, driven to suicide by the weight of his crimes and the knowledge that federal investigators were closing in. The real question is, who has been protecting his criminal enterprise, who has been profiting from the systematic destruction of Cherokee families, and who was willing to see an innocent woman hang to protect their guilty secrets?" From the back of the courtroom, a voice spoke up, thin and wavering, but carrying the authority of advanced age and hard-earned wisdom. "I can answer that question." Old Mary Whitehorse rose slowly from her seat, her arthritic joints protesting every movement. "I've been keeping silent for 3 years, telling myself I was too old and too frightened to speak the truth, but I won't watch another innocent person die while I sit in comfortable cowardice." The gallery turned to stare at the elderly woman, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and apprehension. Mary Whitehorse was Socorro's eldest resident, a woman who'd arrived with the first wave of settlers 30 years ago and had witnessed every significant event in the town's history. Her word carried weight that even the most corrupt officials couldn't easily dismiss. "I saw who planted that bottle in Esperanza's room," Mary continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I saw him creeping around the judge's house at dawn, carrying something in a cloth bag. I saw him come back out empty-handed, looking around like he was afraid someone was watching." She pointed a gnarled finger at the front row of the gallery where banker Morrison sat frozen in his seat like a deer caught in lamplight. "It was you, Morrison. You planted that evidence because you knew the federal investigation would expose your money laundering operation, your illegal land deals, your partnership with Judge Mortimer in stealing Cherokee property." Morrison shot to his feet, his face purple with rage and terror. "That's a lie. You're a senile old woman whose word isn't worth the breath it takes to speak it. I demand—" "You demand nothing," Nate interrupted, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his revolver. "You've been caught, Morrison. The federal investigators have been tracking money transfers between your bank and Judge Mortimer's accounts for months. They know about the railroad bribes, the fraudulent mineral rights, the payments to cowboys willing to terrorize Cherokee families into abandoning their land claims." The banker's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbling before the eyes of his neighbors and business associates. For years, he'd hidden behind his position as Socorro's most trusted financial institution, using his access to territorial records and government contracts to orchestrate a criminal enterprise that had destroyed countless lives and stolen hundreds of thousands of acres of Cherokee land. Judge Patterson finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Mr. Crowfeather, if these accusations are proven true, this court owes the defendant far more than an apology. We owe her justice, real justice, not the perverted mockery we've been dispensing in the name of law and order." Esperanza looked around the courtroom at the faces of people she'd served and feared for 3 years, seeing them clearly for the first time. Some showed genuine shame and remorse, others defensive anger at having their comfortable lies exposed, and a few reflected the kind of moral awakening that comes only through the painful recognition of one's own complicity in evil. "I don't want your apologies," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden hush. "Apologies don't bring back my mother. Apologies don't restore the families you've destroyed or the children you've stolen. What I want is for this community to look in the mirror and see what you've become, and then decide whether you're brave enough to become something better." The storm outside reached its full fury as her words echoed through the courtroom, lightning illuminating the tall windows and thunder shaking the very foundations of the building that had housed so much injustice. And in that moment of natural violence and human revelation, Socorro County began to reckon with the terrible price of its comfortable silence. The moment of truth that had been building for 3 years finally shattered like glass against stone when Daniel Whitmore, the blind newspaper boy, rose from his seat in the back corner of the courtroom. At 15, Daniel had learned to navigate Socorro's dusty streets and crowded buildings through sound and memory, his other senses sharpened to compensate for the sight he'd lost in a mining accident when he was 12. But it was precisely because he couldn't see that he'd become the town's most reliable witness to its darkest secrets. "I heard everything," Daniel said, his young voice cutting through the storm of accusations and denials that had erupted after Mary Whitehorse's revelation about banker Morrison. "I was delivering papers to Judge Mortimer's house the morning he died, and I heard him talking to himself in his study." He wasn't alone. He was talking to someone who wasn't there. Judge Patterson leaned forward, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing dread. "What do you mean, son? Speak plainly." Daniel's sightless eyes turned toward the sound of the judge's voice with uncanny precision. "He was talking to his son, Your Honor, to Timothy. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd made terrible mistakes, that he couldn't live with what he'd done. He said the Cherokee girl, Esperanza's mother, had been trying to save Timothy, not hurt him. Said she died because he was too proud to admit his son had died, trying to protect sacred ground instead of desecrate it." The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the rain against the windows and the shallow breathing of people who'd suddenly realized their comfortable lies were about to be stripped away like bark from a burning tree. Esperanza felt her knees weaken as the truth about her mother's death, a truth she'd suspected but never dared voice, finally came to light. "Judge Mortimer said he'd spent 5 years destroying innocent families because he couldn't bear to admit his son died a better man than his father," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger as he recalled the conversation that had haunted him for 3 days. "He said he'd taken the belladonna from Little Dove's medicine bag after she was killed, had been using it to treat his heart condition, but that morning he was going to take enough to join Timothy." Prosecutor Hayes, sensing the complete collapse of his case and possibly his career, made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Your Honor, the testimony of a blind child who claims to have overheard a dead man's private conversation hardly constitutes reliable evidence." "We cannot overturn a murder conviction based on the fantasies of—" "Those weren't fantasies," Sheriff Williams interrupted, his voice hollow with the weight of confession. He'd been standing at the back of the courtroom like a man preparing for his own execution, and now he stepped forward with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who'd finally run out of places to hide. "I was there too. I'd come to the judge's house to discuss the federal investigators who'd been asking questions around town. I heard Judge Mortimer's confession through the study window." The sheriff's admission hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Williams had been Socorro's lawman for 15 years, a man whose word had carried the weight of absolute authority in disputes and legal matters. If he was admitting to hearing Judge Mortimer's deathbed confession, then everything they'd believed about the case was not just wrong. It was a deliberate fabrication designed to protect the guilty and destroy the innocent. "Why didn't you speak up?" Judge Patterson's voice cracked with the strain of maintaining judicial composure while his entire worldview collapsed around him. "Why did you allow this trial to proceed if you knew the defendant was innocent?" Williams removed his badge with hands that shook like autumn leaves, setting it on the defendant's table next to Esperanza's shackled wrists. "Because I'm a coward, Your Honor. Because admitting Judge Mortimer killed himself to escape justice would have meant admitting that I'd been helping him cover up murders and land theft for years. Because I was more afraid of losing my job than I was of watching an innocent woman hang." The badge lay on the wooden table like an accusation made of tarnished metal, reflecting the gaslight in fractured patterns that seemed to illuminate every shameful compromise Williams had made during his tenure as Socorro's sheriff. He told himself he was maintaining order, keeping the peace, protecting the community's interests. In truth, he'd been an enforcer for a criminal enterprise that had systematically destroyed Cherokee families and stolen their ancestral lands. Old Mary Whitehorse struggled to her feet again, her arthritic joints protesting but her voice clear and strong. "Sheriff Williams isn't the only coward in this room," she declared, her pale blue eyes sweeping across the faces of her neighbors and friends. "We all knew Judge Mortimer was corrupt. We all saw the Cherokee families disappearing, heard the screams from his house when he disciplined his servants, watched him get richer while good people lost their homes and their lives." She pointed a gnarled finger at the gallery where Socorro's most prominent citizens sat frozen in their seats like rabbits caught in torchlight. Banker Morrison laundered the money. Dr. Stevens falsified death certificates. Mayor Collins signed fraudulent land transfers. Reverend Walsh blessed stolen Cherokee artifacts and called it God's will. We all profited from Judge Mortimer's crimes, and we all chose silence when that profit was threatened. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, impossible to ignore or dispel. One by one, the pillars of Socorro's respectable society began to crumble as their complicity was dragged into the harsh light of truth. Some faces showed genuine horror as they recognized their own moral failures. Others reflected the desperate calculation of people trying to figure out how much they could admit without destroying themselves completely. Dr. Stevens, a thin man with nervous hands who treated every prominent family in the county, rose shakily from his seat. I want to make a statement," he said, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the courthouse windows. Judge Mortimer's heart condition was severe. He'd been taking increasing doses of belladonna for months, ignoring my warnings about the dangers of self-medication. The morning he died, he sent for me, said he wanted to confess his sins before God took him. The doctor's hands trembled as he recalled that final meeting, the weight of secrets that had been eating away at his conscience for 3 days. He told me about the Cherokee families he'd destroyed, about the children he'd stolen and sold to white families, about the women he'd abused under the guise of civilizing them. He said he couldn't face the federal investigators, couldn't bear to have his crimes exposed while he was still alive to see the consequences. Esperanza felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the truth about her mother's death finally emerged in all its horrible clarity. Little Dove hadn't died because she was Cherokee, or because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She died because she'd tried to save Timothy Mortimer from his father's greed, because she'd stood between a young man's conscience and his father's criminal ambitions. Her murder had been the foundation stone of 5 years of systematic genocide, justified by lies and sustained by a community's willful blindness. Nate moved closer to Esperanza's chair, his presence offering comfort without presumption, protection without possessiveness. He'd spent 3 years tracking the network of corruption that had destroyed so many Cherokee families, following a trail of forged documents and murdered witnesses across 3 territories. But he'd never expected to find the heart of that network in a courtroom where an innocent woman was about to be executed for crimes committed by her accusers. "The federal investigation has enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved in Judge Mortimer's criminal enterprise," Nate said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen too much injustice to be impressed by local officials and their comfortable lies. Bank records, forged land deeds, testimony from surviving Cherokee families, medical records of children stolen from their parents, all of it documented, all of it admissible in territorial court. The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a burial shroud, and for the first time since the trial began, the balance of power shifted decisively away from Socorro's established elite towards something that might actually resemble justice. But even as hope flickered in Esperanza's heart, she understood that the road ahead would be long and dangerous, paved with the broken promises of a legal system that had never been designed to protect people like her. The revelation that would shatter everything came not from Nate's federal documents or the confessions of corrupt officials, but from the trembling hands of a woman who had carried the heaviest secret of all. Maria Santos, Judge Mortimer's elderly housekeeper who had worked in silence for 23 years, rose from her seat in the servants' section with the slow dignity of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. "There's something else you all need to know," Maria said in accented English, her weathered face bearing the lines of too many years spent witnessing unspeakable things while pretending blindness and deafness were the prices of survival. Something about who Esperanza really is, and why Judge Mortimer kept her in his house all these years. The courtroom, which had begun to settle into the comfortable rhythm of confession and absolution, suddenly tensed again. Esperanza felt her heart constrict with a fear deeper than the terror of hanging, the fear that the one foundation of her identity she'd clung to through years of abuse and degradation was about to be stripped away like everything else. "Esperanza is not Little Dove's daughter," Maria continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke words she'd held locked in her heart for over 20 years. "She is Judge Mortimer's daughter, his legitimate daughter, born of his first wife, Catherine Mortimer, who died giving birth to her in 1863. The words hit the courtroom like lightning striking dry timber. Gasps echoed from the gallery, and several people rose from their seats as if physical movement might help them escape the implications of what they'd just heard. Judge Patterson's gavel slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. Esperanza felt the world tilt sideways, her vision blurring as 21 years of carefully constructed identity collapsed into ash and confusion. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking like a child's. "My mother was Little Dove. She was Cherokee. She was killed by cowboys when I was 4 years old. I remember her songs, her stories about our people." "You remember the woman who raised you," Maria said gently, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Little Dove was your nursemaid, hired by Judge Mortimer when his wife died in childbirth. She loved you like her own daughter, taught you Cherokee songs and stories, protected you from your father's growing madness. But she was not your blood mother." The housekeeper reached into her apron and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. "Your real mother's wedding ring, her Bible, the birth certificate Judge Mortimer tried to destroy after Little Dove's death. I saved them, thinking someday you'd need to know the truth about who you are." Nate stepped forward, his dark eyes studying Esperanza's face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "The Cherokee blood you feel running through your veins isn't biological," he said quietly. "It's spiritual, cultural. Little Dove raised you as her own child, taught you to honor Cherokee ways, made you part of our people through love and choice rather than birth." The revelation crashed over Esperanza like a flash flood, washing away everything she thought she knew about herself. She was not Cherokee by blood, but by adoption, not the daughter of a murdered medicine woman, but of a corrupt judge's dead wife. The identity she'd clung to through years of abuse and degradation had been built on love rather than genetics, on choice rather than biology. Why? Esperanza's voice came out as little more than a whisper. Why did he treat me like a servant if I was his daughter? Why did he let me believe little Dove was my mother? Maria's face crumpled with grief as she recalled those terrible years after little Dove's murder. After Timothy died and the federal investigation began, Judge Mortimer went mad with guilt and paranoia. He convinced himself that you were cursed, that Cherokee influence had corrupted his bloodline and destroyed his family. He thought if he could break the Cherokee spirit in you, if he could make you forget Little Dove's teachings and accept your place as his property, he could somehow undo the damage to his family name. The cruelty of it took Esperanza's breath away. Her father, and the word felt like poison in her mind, had tried to destroy every trace of the woman who had loved and raised her, had subjected her to years of abuse and degradation in a twisted attempt to purge her of the Cherokee identity that was her most precious inheritance. Banker Morrison, sensing an opportunity in the chaos of revelation, lurched to his feet with renewed confidence. This changes everything. If the defendant is Judge Mortimer's legitimate daughter, she inherits his entire estate, the ranch, the mineral rights, the railroad contracts. She had the strongest possible motive for murder, far beyond anything we previously imagined. But Nate was already shaking his head, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. No, Morrison. This changes nothing about the murder case because there was no murder. But it changes everything about your criminal enterprise, because Esperanza's inheritance includes all of Judge Mortimer's financial records, including the detailed accounts of every bribe you took, every Cherokee family you helped destroy, every child you helped steal and sell to white families. The banker's face went white as the implications sank in. Judge Mortimer had been meticulous in his record-keeping, documenting every transaction in his criminal empire with the obsessive detail of a man who understood that information was power. If those records fell into federal hands, the entire network of corruption that had enriched Socorro's elite for decades would be exposed. Furthermore, Nate continued, producing yet another document from his seemingly inexhaustible supply, Judge Mortimer's will, written 3 weeks before his death and witnessed by Father Miguel at the mission, leaves his entire estate not to his blood daughter, but to the Cherokee Restoration Fund, to be administered by the territorial government for the return of stolen lands and the compensation of displaced families. Esperanza felt a strange mixture of relief and loss as she processed this final revelation. Her father, she still couldn't think of Judge Mortimer in any other terms, had experienced some kind of deathbed conversion, some moment of clarity that had shown him the magnitude of his crimes. In his final act, he'd tried to undo decades of damage by ensuring his wealth would go toward healing rather than harm. "He disinherited me," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of wondering sadness. Even at the end, even when he was trying to make amends, he couldn't bear to acknowledge me as his daughter. Old Mary Whitehorse struggled to her feet again, her arthritic joints protesting, but her voice clear and strong. "Child, he didn't disinherit you because he didn't love you. He disinherited you because he knew the Cherokee people had given you something far more valuable than money. They'd given you an identity built on honor instead of corruption, on healing instead of harm." The truth of Mary's words resonated through the courtroom, and for the first time since the revelations began, Esperanza felt a spark of something that might have been hope. She was not Cherokee by blood, but she was Cherokee by choice, by the love of a woman who had sacrificed her life to protect and raise her. That identity was not diminished by the revelation of her true parentage. If anything, it was made more precious by the knowledge that it had been freely given and gratefully received. Sheriff Williams stepped forward, his face haggard with exhaustion and shame. "Miss Delacroix, Miss Mortimer, Whatever name you choose to carry, I want you to know that charges against you are being dropped immediately. More than that, I'm recommending that the territorial government open a full investigation into every case that's come through this courthouse in the past 5 years. Judge Patterson nodded slowly, his weathered face showing every one of his 68 years. The court owes you more than an apology, young lady. We owe you justice, and we owe the Cherokee people justice. And we owe this community the hard work of rebuilding something decent from the ruins of what we've allowed to happen here. But even as hope began to flicker in hearts that had grown accustomed to despair, Esperanza understood that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The network of corruption that had enriched Socorro's elite for decades wouldn't disappear overnight, and the prejudice that had made their crimes possible ran deeper than laws or court orders could reach. "Justice isn't something you can give me," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Justice is something we have to build together, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. The question isn't whether you owe me an apology. The question is whether you're brave enough to do the work of earning forgiveness." Thunder rumbled overhead as her words settled into the silence, and the rain against the windows seemed to wash the air clean of the lies and comfortable deceptions that had poisoned this community for too long. In the end, Esperanza thought, perhaps that was what justice really meant, not punishment for the guilty, but the courage to choose truth over comfort, healing over harm, love over fear. The sun broke through the storm clouds as the courthouse doors opened for the last time on what would be remembered as the day Socorro County began to reckon with its sins. The rain had washed the dust from the streets but left the deeper stains untouched. Those would require years of patient work to cleanse. Esperanza walked out into the clean desert air with her hands finally free of shackles, but she carried invisible chains that would take longer to break. Nate stood beside her on the courthouse steps, not touching but present in the way of someone who understood that healing required both companionship and space. The marriage certificate that had saved her life lay folded in his coat pocket, its legal fiction having served its purpose. Now they faced the more complicated question of what truth meant when built on necessary lies. "The certificate is real," Nate said quietly, answering the question she hadn't yet found courage to ask. "Cherokee ceremony, 2 years ago at the reservation. You were fevering from pneumonia, dying in Judge Mortimer's house while he refused to send for a doctor. Maria Santos came to my grandmother begging for help." Esperanza closed her eyes, fragments of memory floating back like pieces of a shattered mirror. She remembered the taste of bitter herbs, the sound of ancient songs, hands gentle as her mother's, little doves, had been. "You married a woman who was unconscious and dying. That doesn't seem like much of a foundation for anything real." "My grandmother said the spirits told her you would survive if you had something to anchor you to this world, something stronger than the hate that was killing you from inside." Nate's dark eyes studied her face with careful attention. "Cherokee law says a marriage made in ceremony is binding until both parties choose otherwise. But territorial law says you're free to make your own choice about what that means." The implications settled between them like morning mist, neither heavy nor light, but simply present. They were bound by Cherokee custom, but free by choice, connected by shared purpose, but not by obligation. It was perhaps the only honest foundation on which anything lasting could be built. Behind them, the courthouse had emptied slowly as Socorro's citizens emerged into a world where comfortable lies no longer provided shelter from uncomfortable truths. Old Mary Whitehorse moved carefully down the steps, her arthritis making each movement deliberate, but her back straighter than it had been in years. She paused beside Esperanza, her weathered hand briefly touching the young woman's shoulder. "Your Cherokee mother raised you well, child. She taught you to carry pain without letting it poison you, to seek truth without destroying hope. That's a rarer gift than noble blood or inherited wealth. Mary's pale blue eyes held depths of sorrow and hard-won wisdom. I failed you and your mother when it mattered most. But if you'll have the help of a foolish old woman who's finally found her courage, I'd like to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends." Esperanza felt tears threatening, but held them back, not from shame, but from the overwhelming recognition that healing sometimes came from the most unexpected places. "Mrs. Whitehorse, you spoke the truth when it counted. That took more courage than staying silent would have taken cowardice." Down the street, Sheriff Williams was pinning a handwritten notice to the jailhouse door, a resignation letter that would officially end his 15-year career in law enforcement. His badge lay on his desk inside, next to a bottle of whiskey he'd considered but ultimately rejected. Some forms of escape were too easy, and he'd chosen the harder path of staying to face the consequences of his choices. Dr. Stevens emerged from his office carrying a medical bag that seemed heavier than usual, though it contained the same instruments and medicines it always had. He'd volunteered to provide free medical care to any Cherokee families willing to return to Socorro County, understanding that healing the community's wounds would require more than legal justice. Some debts could only be paid through years of service. Banker Morrison had disappeared entirely, his office locked, and his personal accounts mysteriously emptied sometime during the night. The federal investigators would track him down eventually, but his flight confirmed what everyone now understood. The corruption had roots too deep for any single trial to uncover completely. Real change would require the patient work of years, not the dramatic satisfaction of a single day's revelations. As the afternoon lengthened, people began to gather in small groups throughout the town, having conversations that should have happened years earlier. Some spoke of Cherokee families they remembered, wondering what had become of children who'd disappeared or adults who'd simply stopped coming to market day. Others discussed the railroad contracts and mining rights that had seemed like prosperity but had been built on theft and murder. Father Miguel opened the mission church and began the long process of cataloging Cherokee artifacts that Judge Mortimer had claimed as curiosities, but which represented sacred objects stolen from families during forced relocations. Each item would need to be identified and, where possible, returned to surviving relatives or appropriate tribal authorities. Esperanza found herself drawn to the small cemetery behind the mission where a simple wooden cross marked the grave they'd given Little Dove. The Cherokee woman who had died protecting Judge Mortimer's son lay buried in consecrated ground, though few at the time had considered her worthy of such grace. Someone, probably Maria Santos, had been leaving wildflowers on the grave for 3 years. "She loved you like her own blood," Nate said, joining Esperanza beside the grave. "Cherokee adoption isn't about changing your nature. It's about expanding your family. You carry her teachings, her songs, her healing knowledge. That makes you Cherokee in every way that matters." The weight of identity settled differently on Esperanza's shoulders now, not as a burden of blood, but as a choice consciously made and continuously renewed. She was Catherine Mortimer's biological daughter, but Little Dove's true child, heir to corruption but raised in wisdom, white by birth but Cherokee by love and loyalty. "What happens now?" she asked, not just of Nate, but of the desert wind and the setting sun and the spirits of all the people who died for the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. "Now we do the work," Nate replied simply. "The federal investigators will need testimony, the Cherokee families will need help reclaiming their land, and this community will need people willing to build something better on the ruins of what came before." He paused, his hand moving to the turquoise ring that had belonged to his grandfather. "The marriage ceremony can be dissolved, if you choose, but the partnership, the work of healing, that's something we could do together if you're willing." Esperanza looked out over Socorro County as the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful country, worth fighting for, worth the difficult work of redemption. She thought of Little Dove's songs, of Cherokee children who deserved to learn their own history, of white families who needed to understand that justice wasn't punishment but the courage to choose differently. "I'm willing," she said. And the words carried the weight of a vow made not just to Nate but to the memory of everyone who died for this moment of truth. Let's build something worthy of the people we've lost. The desert wind carried her words across the valley like a promise, and for the first time in 3 years, Socorro County began to imagine what forgiveness might look like when earned through honest work rather than demanded through comfortable lies. Sometimes life teaches us that the most profound happiness isn't found in getting what we want, but in discovering we already had what we needed all along. Like Esperanza, many of us have spent years believing we were defined by our wounds, our losses, our failures to measure up to someone else's expectations. We've carried the weight of other people's mistakes, shouldered blame that was never ours to bear, and wondered why happiness seemed to slip through our fingers like desert sand. But here's what I've learned from watching families heal, communities rebuild, and hearts find their way home after decades of wandering. True happiness isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of purpose. It's the moment when you realize that your struggles weren't meaningless suffering, but preparation for the work you were meant to do. It's understanding that the love you thought you'd lost was actually growing stronger in the quiet spaces of your heart, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. It's discovering that the family you thought was broken was actually just scattered, and that coming home doesn't always mean returning to where you started. Sometimes it means creating something entirely new. Have you ever discovered that what you thought was your greatest weakness was actually preparing you for your life's most important work? What moment taught you that happiness was something you build rather than something you find?